Hi, my name is Holly West, and I'm the author of the Mistress of Fortune historical mystery series and the editor of Murder a Go-Go's crime fiction inspired by the music of the Go-Go's. I'm here today with Lori Rader-Day. She's the Edgar Award nominated and Anthony and Mary Higgins Clark Award winning author of several novels, including Under a Dark Sky and The Lucky One. Her most recent novel is Death at Greenway. It's a historical thriller set in and around Agatha Christie's English holiday home during World War II. Death at Greenway was named as a most anticipated thriller by Goodreads and Country Living, and it's an October 2021 library reads pick. Congratulations. That's fantastic. Welcome. Thank you for joining me. I really, really appreciate it because I haven't gotten to talk to you in so long. No, it's a pleasure. But first of all, tell us a little bit about Death at Greenway.
Death at Greenway is based on a true story when the English government mostly was evacuating children out of London and other major metropolitan areas ahead of the Blitz or the expected bombings. It took a little while for them to actually get started. 3 million, mostly children, were evacuated. 10 children were evacuated to Agatha Christie's holiday home in South Devon. It's called Greenway. When I read that little fact in a nonfiction book about Agatha Christie, I was reading in bed and I sat up and was just so into that idea. I just had a picture in my mind of what that story could be, which I had to change a little bit over time, which we can talk about. But I just wanted to read that story. I wanted to read about the kids who were sent to Agatha Christie's house, but it turned out that nobody had written it yet. So after many years of kind of sitting on that idea and thinking maybe I wasn't the person who should write it, I finally started researching it and found that actually the children were rather small. They were, in some cases, infants, but they were all under the age of 5. And so my story changed a little bit, and I started to write about some of the adults who were there. Bridey Kelly is a nurse in training who has been sort of sent away from the hospital where she's being trained because she's made an error that has cost the life of a patient, a soldier. So to get into the good graces of her matron again, she takes on this job of evacuating children to Greenway, and she's not really up for it. She's got a lot of reasons why hanging out with children in the country, not getting what she wants, which is to be a nurse, is a big problem.
I had never heard of observers before. And so what are they and what role did they play during World War II?
Mass observation was sort of a sociological experiment in England that started prior to the war. And what they did is they would go into the pubs and go into the churches and go into the, wherever people were hanging out, the markets, and sort of start conversations or listen to what people were talking about during times of great import to Britain. They wanted to know what the average person thought about these big things going on. I don't think at the early days it was being used for much. It was just someone academically minded was very interested in what the regular Joe was thinking about these huge moments. But it became a bigger enterprise. It became a bigger sociological experiment. And it did have some war work. I don't know that we have ever heard entirely what they did. I have played fast and loose with what they were assigned to do in this book. I'm sorry, mass observation, for messing up your history. I did a little bit of research into it, and some of what they did was reacting to, maybe researching, maybe getting reactions to war propaganda, the Allied propaganda, propaganda doesn't sound like the right word when you're talking about your own, but it is. It's, the posters that they hung up in the tube and the posters they hung up to get, many posters were designed about evacuation, for instance, about, hey, parents, please bring your children to be evacuated. Don't leave them to Hitler. And some of these things are really, I would hang them up in my house. They're beautiful. They're striking, but they're also, some of them are kind of funny. Like there's a ghosty looking Hitler behind the tree peeking around. And some of them are, a soldier talking to a little boy, hey, Sonny, your role in the war is to go to the country, like it's working at all levels, at the adult, at the child level, trying to get people to take their children to safety. And then once they were there, leave them there. This was a big issue because once many children were evacuated before, as soon as war was announced, they were out of there. They had worked out how to get the children into the country. And then bombing of London didn't start for months. It was called the Phony War. Well, if there are no bombings going on and here we are away from our parents, the parents were going to visit and then bringing them back. And so some children had to be evacuated twice. And some of those kinds of messages were sent through mass observation to see, okay, what are the people thinking? Okay, what would they think of this? And is this the right message? How do we get them to do what we want them to do?
Did you know that children I didn't know.
You didn't know about evacuations at all?
No, well, you mentioned your bad history education.
I mean, I knew that, okay, but here's how I knew about it. Here's the only way I knew about it. TV, films, books. That's the only way I'd ever heard about it. Bed Knobs and Broomsticks is one of my favorite Disney movies one of my favorite movies of all time. And that entire movie is predicated on the idea that this group of children, their siblings in this case, are evacuated to the countryside and they're placed in the house of a woman, Angela Lansbury, who's training to be a witch. And so that's the idea I had when I heard about this Agatha Christie house episode. My imagination went immediately to a group of children, siblings who are evacuated to Agatha Christie's house in the country, and they're old enough to sort of seep, into the mystery element of Agatha Christie's life, to have the house and her presence sort of seep into them. And then maybe they start solving crimes, solving mysteries around the house. Unfortunately, they were all under the age of 5. And many people said to me, if that's a problem for your story, then you can just change it. You can just change it to 5 children who are 10. And, that sounded great, except my goal was to, this is a thing I knew. Agatha Christie herself says there are 10 of them, they're under the age of 5. And so I didn't want to deviate from that.
Talking about the vax, there is a scene in the book where Bridey is confronted by a man who has lost his son in the war. He's very angry about the vax. He says they've taken the rations. And then he is also kind of disparaging about the work that she's doing in the war effort. Was that a common sentiment?
That actually was a general attitude, especially as the war raged on. Like at first it was like, of course, evacuate your children to our countryside village. Here's houses, here are places, here, you can take over this area and your children can be in our schools with our children. It was all very, the Blitz spirit. It was all that. But as the war went on and, everyone had to deal with all this stuff for a long time, and rations were in some ways a little cruel, how much meat, how much milk, how much of this every person, man, woman, and child could have. And of course, the longer it went on, the harsher it was. People started to turn a little bit on the vax. And maybe there were people who were not into it at the beginning, but definitely as things went on, there was an attitude of, these children from the slums of London are going to be spoiled, because all children coming from London were like, poor children. We can't show them opulence. I use that in the book because that was a real issue. We can't give them a better life than they're going to expect when they go back. That was a huge thing that some people thought.
The advanced buzz on the book has been overwhelmingly positive, which must be like super gratifying. But you've also said that this was the most challenging book of your career to write. So I want to hear about that.
It has been very gratifying to get some of the reviews. I get a star from Publishers Weekly, which was, of course, huge. The book is out, so I can say that it is also an Indie Next pick for October. So it's an Indie Next and a Library Reads pick, and I've never had those two things together for a single book before. So I'm really feeling very lucky for all the support that I've gotten from HarperCollins and from librarians and from booksellers and of course friends who are sharing the news. But it was the most challenging project of my life. I think easily the biggest part of why it was challenging is the research. So much history had to be sort of taken in and learned and written down and synthesized to get all of the pieces together that I wanted it to be. First of all, I'm not a research person. It's not just that my books have never required historical research. It is that I am not a research person. I don't like to do homework before I have to write. I'm a pantser 100%. Well, probably 80% at this point, but I just don't really like that getting ready portion of writing a book. But I had to for this book because I just didn't have enough knowledge within me to start writing from what I knew. And the other thing was I wanted to do the research because the research had never been done. There were pieces here and there about this incident, but nothing had actually been brought together in one place. And the book I wanted to write used as much fact as possible. And then when I ran out of fact, I would, fictionalize. I would get a chance to write, a fictional story. The thing is that none of this research had been done. And so every time I would start to scratch the surface, I would find more and more fact, at which point I was getting like boxed in more and more and more and more into what kind of story I could write. So that was in itself very challenging. It was also a challenging time. I mean, I was doing the research started the research in 2019, family issues. My dad passed away in early 2019. And then I think we all know what happened in early 2020. So it was sort of the timing as well. And then I, of course, signed on to do all sorts of things in the rest of my life that take up time, like volunteering for Sisters in Crime and that sort of thing.
You've talked about rewriting the book completely.
When the lockdown happened, I went into isolation on March 9th, 2020, maybe a little earlier than some people because I have some health issues that I was pretty sure would be a problem if I caught COVID. So I went into isolation March 9th, and I had been given notes from my editor on my first draft, but they were not helpfully very specific. They were rather vague, and I love my editor, but it was sort of like, oh, I think you just need to pull the strings a little tighter and make it a little more urgent. And I wrote down, pull the strings tighter, more urgent. But then I sort of wandered around my house for a couple of weeks thinking, I finally came to the realization I didn't think that she was right. I realized that I had not written the book that I had meant to write. Once I started talking about the book, what I was working on now, or what I was on panels and that sort of thing, or talking to friends at the conferences, I would say, I'm working on this story based on real life, Agatha Christie's house, World War II. And those two things were very exciting, I think, to especially people like us, right? Mystery writers and mystery readers.
Yeah.
Eyes would light up when I said Agatha Christie's house, World War II. And when I was really starting to think about, some revisions for this book, I realized that I had not written the book that would light up their eyes the way that I had not written the book that they had envisioned when they heard those words. So March 9th, isolation, I went to Greenway and I rewrote the entire thing from not entirely a loss. I was able to save some sections, but I had another timeline built into the book. I scrapped that entire timeline, which, as my agent pointed out, was an interesting choice because a lot of the action happened in that timeline. So I was throwing away a lot of the story. So then I had to rebuild it back up and weave a story into what I wanted the book to be. The book actually benefited from me being isolated for several months. I wrote it entirely anew between March 9th and July 1st.
Not to compare the pandemic with war, but the mindset that you might have been in, because it was totally different for us. We had never experienced something like that before. Yeah. Do you think that informed you in your writing?
It absolutely did. I'm the same with you. I don't want to equate the two things because they're not the same, but being stuck inside, if you remember the early days, especially if you're someone like me who was very concerned about catching it. I didn't go to the grocery store. My husband had to start doing that. I stayed inside. I had a backyard and eventually got a puppy, pandemic puppy, and that sent me on walks. But mostly just inside for, let's call it 7 months, 8 months, and rewriting and living at Greenway, and really just that's where what I was doing. But I got an insight into my main character, Bridey Kelly, the nurse in training I mentioned earlier. She tells most of the story, although there are multiple voices who help tell the story. She says early on, I don't have the Blitz spirit. And that was literally a thing I thought to myself, because what my reaction to the lockdown was, hunker down. Okay, I'm gonna be inside. This is what I was smaller. I was, hunched over and protecting myself any way I could, and my life was smaller. And that's how she feels. She feels small and hard and can't let anything in for her own reasons that are different than mine. But I would see people doing comedians doing free concerts and musicians doing free shows on Facebook, and everyone, doing some charity work and baking bread and all I'm going to do this year-long project. And I'm just like, I don't want to do any of that. I just want to live through this. And when I thought I don't have the Blitz spirit, I thought, oh, I understand her. And that's where the Bridey Kelly that's in the book came from.
While I was reading it, some of the language, it did sound authentically English. And I wondered, like, I wouldn't have, my novels are set in England too, but they're like hundreds of years ago. So I felt like I had some flexibility there because no one knows what they really talked like. And how I would do it is I would write it as like how I would say it as an American. And then I would go back and I would kind of like zhuzh it up a little bit to make it sound as if someone from that period in England might have talked that way. But I did feel like I had some leeway on that. But with you have less leeway,
right?
I feel. And yet I feel like you nailed it. Okay. You nailed the language, and it made me wonder, like, who were your early readers that helped you make it sound authentic?
Well, I wrote it, the way that I hoped sounded British. The goal was always to make it as true to the story as possible. Not the fictional part, but the framework based in reality. And that was, I set pretty high standards for myself. I wanted it to be as English as possible. And I have never lived in England, but I do have a pretty good ear for that sort of thing. So I wrote it, did a little research, had to look up various phrases and words, and sometimes look for slang that would work. And of course, very specific slang, because 1940s, but like 1940, really 1930s, because this is very early 1940s. In England, it's always very hard to get the English experience when you're Googling from America, because Google wants to give you, the nurse's cape from the American Red Cross. And I'm like, no, the British one. So that kind of thing was a little difficult. But I also had Anne Cleves. So she was an early, enthusiast for the story when I told her what I was trying to do. And she said, I'll read it for you. When you're ready to share it, I'll read it for you for Englishness. Anne Cleves is going to read my book for Englishness. And she sent me this lovely email that just went, like page by page. Here's the thing. And it wasn't, so much work, but it was so helpful, because there were things that I just would not have noticed on my own.
So Death in Greenway is a work of fiction, but it is based in part on real life events. My first novel is based on a real life unsolved murder. And one of my biggest challenges in fictionalizing the story was determining which facts lent themselves to good storytelling, if that makes sense. And I do feel like you did answer that a little bit, but I wanted you to elaborate on that. What was your approach to that? Because I disregarded, like timeline wise, I disregarded things that didn't make for a good story.
That would have been probably a better approach than the one I took, to be honest. Because there was so little written about the episode. Again, I wanted to get as much about the real incident as I could into the story. as the framework. And so my research started with who's in the house. It's Agatha Christie's house with her second husband, Max Mellon. I know that Max goes to London. He does some war work, and then eventually he's sent to Egypt, I believe, to do some more war work. While he's in London, while he's in Egypt, Agatha goes to London and sort of famously goes back to work as an apothecary at University Hospital in London. Skills that she had learned and put to use in World War I, and why she became so knowledgeable about poisons and wrote about poisons so much. So that was sort of famously the story, that she spent the war in London. And then I learned about this group of children with the 2 chaperones and the 2 nurses going to the house. I thought, okay, Agatha's out of the way. She's in London. Great. That was my first idea, because I love Agatha Christie, and I wasn't sure that I could fictionalize her. I didn't want to be honest. And I didn't think that she had been there. So I really didn't want to shoehorn her in. But then in the research, I found that she actually had been at the house, especially when I read her autobiography and I read Max's autobiography. They both talk about the moment when war was announced on the radio. The Prime Minister, Chamberlain, announces the war, and they are sitting in the kitchen, or they're in the kitchen at Greenway when it happens. And at that point, I thought, well, Agatha Christie, World War II, I can't ignore that moment. And so then she's in the book, and she's just in the prologue. But then both my editor and my agent are like, could she be in there more? And as I did my research, I realized, because I thought, okay, well, she rented the house out, so then she left and she went to London. That is true, but there was overlap. She privately rented the house. She would have been there to meet this group of people. So there's another moment where, it was kind of unavoidable. And then I learned that she had tried to sell Greenway at one point during the war, and sort of traveled down there once in a while for her own purposes. And I thought, well, she's coming in and out, so I have to make room for that piece of the story. I don't think that my problem was that I had so many facts that had to be either put in or left out because they mucked up the story. It's that I needed to generate a story that fit into all these things that I was finding out. And then, I went to visit Greenway twice, once with my friend, and we stayed nearby. Actually, we stayed in an inn at the end of the universe, which is actually used in the story as well, the inn that Bridey has to visit at one point, trying to find room for the story, because there's so much great research that I wanted to work in. And of course, none of that matters if there isn't a story worth telling. So finding a story that fit into everything that I wanted to tell everyone about this episode and the people I was researching, because I started researching, okay, who's at the house? This is where the problem was, is that I don't love research, and yet I went down the rabbit hole, just like every historic author I've ever talked to or heard talk. You just can't get to the end of what you can know about everything.
You mentioned the Arbitthnots. Tell me a little bit more about how you came to understand who they were.
I knew the last name because Agatha, in her autobiography, says that the house was rented for a war nursery, as they called them, to a Mrs. Arbithnot. A Mrs. Arbithnot. No first name. Thank you, Agatha. You knew it, but she didn't put it in. And there's no name. And then her husband, and then 10 children under 5, and the 2 nurses, two hospital nurses. Importantly, she says that. So I went after the Arbitthnots first to see if I could find them. And I knew that the children were from St. Pancras, an area of London. So I looked through census documents to find if there was a couple named Arbithnot who lived in St. Pancras. And there was only one couple in this area, this small area of London. And I thought, that was easy. No problem. This research stuff is overrated, right? So I started writing the book based on what I could find out about them. And they were a fascinating couple, a young couple. She was an actress. Her young husband was in the military. So he would have been away. So I'm like, okay, so that should have been my first clue, because I think Agatha does say he was there. And I had not read the entire autobiography yet, so I didn't know that. All that to say, 30,000 words into this draft, I find out that the Arbitthnots are the Arbitthnots. These are not the right, this is not the right couple. And I had written, let's call it 10 to 12,000 words with them as well, mostly her as the character. And so that had to be basically thrown away. I just saved it. And some of it became useful later. I used it for a different moment with a different character. I got some help from another source that doesn't want to be named. So I could triangulate some information and start to find out who the real ones were. One of my best sources for this book is one of the children. Doreen, who gets a starring role in the book, a character based on her, but who has become a friend by email, my little pen pal from Canada. She turns 83 soon.
Do you think you'll write any more historical novels?
That is such a tough question. I can't rule it out. I mean, this one took some skin with it. It was a very difficult project for me. Lots of people do it all the time, but for me, it was rather difficult, but I do have some other ideas that I would like to explore. So maybe.
I feel more freedom when I was writing my historicals than I do writing modern novels. Part of it is my insecurity about knowing all of the technology that exists now to solve crimes. And I kind of understand why Sue Grafton made the decision to keep Kinsey in the 1980s, because she didn't have to worry about how, by the time she got to the 2010s, all of that technology.
That's interesting because, of course, I feel out of my element by having to have, historical context, which I just don't know. It's not the kind of stuff that I retain. And so any historical piece I would do, I have to do a ton of research. And because I'm insecure about it, I overdo it. This is how I am with everything that I'm insecure about. I have to overdo it to make sure that I feel comfortable with it. Whenever I teach something, that's how I approach it. But, I have a couple of other ideas that maybe have some legs and maybe I'll give them a shot. But I think my next project might be contemporary again. I feel pretty comfortable in contemporary, but I also don't do a lot of technology. I don't do a lot of police procedural stuff because I do, psychological suspense. I do regular people who come against crime, not people who are trained in all the forensic sciences, that sort of thing.
Your grasp of character and voice and language is top notch.
Thank you.
Really, I can't think of anyone who's better at it. Maybe I'll stop this interview and I'll think of 10, but also I like the idea that you use your protagonists are normal people who just end up in these situations. And I think that you're very, very good at that.
Well, thank you very much. I just feel like the things I like to write about are, and the things I like to read, those are the kind of books I like to read. I like to read people who are, I like to read some detective. I like to read some spy. I like to read some, not a lot of technology stuff. I don't really find that as interesting. Police procedural. Yeah. Tana French is one of my favorite writers, and she does police procedural. She does it character driven though. I like character driven. I like to find out, who people are over the course of a book. That's more important to me than the thrills and the plot stuff.
Death at Greenway is available on October 12th. And I also recommend signing up for Lori's newsletter, which you can find the sign up on her website at LoriRaderDay.com. She's sharing behind the scenes tidbits about researching and writing the book. And it's a wonderful accompaniment to the book itself. Lori, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it so much. And I've enjoyed this conversation so much.
I have too. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, it's a complete pleasure. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, press the like button and subscribe to this channel for the latest content. See you next time.